Hello, I would like to introduce a new module to the Instruō range. This is the càrn, which is an 8 HP all-analog mixer module, or utility mixer, or utility processor, quad utility processor, depending on how you configure it within a system or what you plan to use it for. I didn't set out to design a mixer module, but we've ended up in that direction, which I'm pretty happy about. It's turned out to be an extremely useful, versatile module that you can see I've got 3 in this system set up, though this one's not actually being utilised in this particular patch. But yeah, I have these dotted about my own performance systems now, and they're extremely useful as serving as extra VCAs where I need them, attenuverters, crossfaders, or submixes for groupings of audio sections within a patch. Yeah, it's kind of an age-old question whether you focus on building a mixer stage within a URX synthesizer, or whether you focus in on building voices and then mix outside of the box with a more traditional outboard mixer, which personally I lean much more to the latter of that camp. So I prefer to just focus in on building a versatile performance system instrument, and then just break out multiple stems if I need through parallel output modules, and then mix that after the fact, or record as stems and then mix after the fact, post-processing and all that. But having a smaller submix capability like the càrn has been really powerful. It's been a big addition to the way that I patch. So yeah, let's go through the details of this a bit before diving into some more extensive patch examples. So you can see there are 4 inputs, so input per channel, 4 outputs, individual output per channel, fader for level or control. We then have a panning stage, so each channel can be panned to stereo to a dedicated stereo output. And this stereo output's got its own master level, which is actually a dual VCA. So CV input, CV attenuator, so you can control your master level dynamically. That's kind of the way that I've curated it to work nicely as a submix setting. So if you've got a combination of voices that you're combining into a single voice, then you can do that and then still have a master control over that. So each channel I've kind of designed to have its own unique quirk, or own unique superpower, to give as wide a range of versatility as possible. So if we look at the first channel here, input, output, we've got fader, pot, and the first 3 channels have got their own CV inputs. So CV input for channel 1, this controls panning. So all the panning circuits, they feature equal power or equal loudness contours. So that gives a 3 dB down point when you're bang in the middle. So it's equal amplitude going to left and right, but both the whole thing's reduced by 3 decibels to give a equal loudness in perception as you're panning across the stereo field, which is very typical of traditional mixers. The CV panner, it features that as well. So I've essentially done this via a pair of linear VCAs, and then there's parallel wave shaping to the CV control to give that equal loudness contour. That being all analog, that can occur at audio rate. Channel 2, this is a more traditional VCA where we've got CV input. The CV itself is actually attenuated by the fader. But if you have nothing patched to the CV input, it's got its own built-in voltage reference. So nothing patched there. Signal in, you've got a mixer channel or attenuator over a signal, or CV controlled VCA with attenuator over the CV signal itself. Channel 3, this one gets a bit quirky. So we've got input, output, CV input, and fader control, but the fader can actually be defined as unipolar positive or bipolar. So unipolar positive, it behaves as a more traditional mixer channel like 1 and 2, but if you set it to bipolar, the fader itself becomes an attenuverter over the signal. So setting it in the middle will give you attenuation, and you can go up to full amplitude positive or full inversion, so negative amplitude. The fader itself will actually sum with the CV input, So if you're treating it as a 4-quadrant multiplier or ring modulator, you'd have carrier signal here, modulator here. With an active modulator, then your fader acts as a DC bias to that, so you can get asymmetrical quadrature multiplication, which can be really nice, a nice audible effect. Channel 4, it ran out of space for its CV jack, so it's gained a jack down here at the bottom. And this is actually a 2-input crossfader channel, so 2 parallel inputs, and you can crossfade that to a single mono source, or that mono source could be panned to your stereo output. So it's very much akin to the 1F crossfader module incorporated into the càrn. Yeah, lots of flexibility. You've got 4 parallel, discretely accessible utility processors, or any combination of them can be used to mix to stereo. I'm going to take a brief look at the back here just to show some of the more set and forget parameters and features. If we look up at the top, there is a switch that defines the state of engagement of a stereo limiter. So for anyone that's familiar with the Instruō stereo oscillator that I released quite recently, it's essentially up to 6 sawtooth waves that can be summed together and cascaded. But if you've got 6 10-volt peak-to-peak sawtooth waves, then you're going to get up to 60-volt peak-to-peak signal, which is well out of the range of what a Eurorack system can generate in terms of signal amplitude. So I built in a stereo limiter into that oscillator, so that if you set all your phases to be a unison, then it would soft clip. It would never hard clip the summed signal. So this is that same approach to circuitry, designed very much or optimized for a more general purpose audio mixing. So it's a bit quirky. The default factory setting is this engaged, because I highly recommend you try it out for summing audio into it. You gain a degree of essentially automatic mixing, where there's a soft ceiling defined, and any amplitudes that approach that, it's just going to keep things nicely contained, and yeah, you can more quickly get to a musical mix between different voices. It's a bit quirky, but it's kind of a tribute back to classic mixing preamps and stuff like that, where the circuitry was a lot more basic than, op amps were all discrete, but a lot of the times there was very little compensation in terms of DC variability or DC offset. So if you look at a classic Neve console, there was DC offset all over the place per channel. So yeah, I think that definitely added to the sound. So there is going to be a bit of variation build to build, because this is all using discrete passives as part of the soft clipping and limiting circuits, diodes and transistors. So it's yeah, there's going to be a little bit of natural character module to module, but it's part of the charm. And if you want, you can get it perfectly transparent by disengaging the limiter, set that to linear, and you get true linear throughput to the output stage, and that will have the risk of hard clipping if you push the signal up to that hard clip ceiling. Yeah, best of both worlds though: soft clipping, limiter, or transparency. Let's look at the lower section here with these arrays of dip switches. There are 2 switches per channel that can be set and forget before you populate it in a system. The top set of dip switches, this defines the normal connection characteristic of the output jacks. So by default, these are all half normaled, meaning that if you patch from an output, it's going to break that signal before it gets to the stereo mix. So for example, I could be using channel 2 and channel 3 as a traditional VCA, CV control, signal in, signal out, and attenuation sweet spot for my CV control. I could be using this as an attenuverter or ring modulator over a signal, but if I'm patching from them discretely, they're no longer getting to the stereo mix. So it means I could use channel 1, channel 2 for combining a pair of voices and distributing across the stereo field. So yeah, so 2 channels utility, 2 channels mixing. That's with the half normal capability. If you set it to fully normaled, if you patch from an output, the signal will also go to the stereo mix. So you can kind of treat it as an aux send type context. and the output will be post-fader as well. So it means you could set an attenuation amount and have it both going to the stereo mix, level balance as you need, as well as sending it elsewhere for parallel processing or further mixing. Yep, the lowest section here, this is a set of dip switches that define AC coupling or DC coupling per channel. So in terms of signal flow, the AC coupling occurs following the output jack normal. So if you've got, say it's half normaled, as it would be in default, if you have no signal patch from the output, it means that the signal is coming in, it's being attenuated, it's then going to the output, which is then connecting to the normal. That then hits the AC coupling circuitry, or bypasses the AC coupling circuitry if that's the case, and then it goes to the panning circuit. So in terms of signal flow, the per channel in and out, that will always be DC coupled, but you can choose to have AC coupling for it going into the panning circuit to the stereo mix. So very much a traditional audio mixing configuration of AC coupling to stereo. Yep, you'll see there are a couple of stereo back jacks here as well. The module ships with one of these, which is a little stereo 3.5mm cable with the hourglass on it, of course. So it means you can patch internal to a system, right angle jacks, keep them low profile enough that they should fit in the majority of cases. Patch from the output of one to the input of another, and you can cascade them. So in this system, for example, I've got two càrns at the top. Nothing actually patched into this one currently, but these are chained in the back, and this one is actually further chained to the Cure module, to my balance output. So in this case, I've got an 8-channel mixer going to stereo balanced line outputs. Keeps it nice and efficient. So they can be curated in that way as cascaded chains for multi-channel mixing. This càrn here in the system, I've got it completely isolated, so it's just used for processing control voltage as it's distributed across the voices in this patch. So I'll stop talking now and let you watch on if you want to see some various patch examples of how the càrn can be utilized in many different ways. Hope you enjoy. Okay, this next section is going to get a bit technical, but I've pre-patched something that's at least quite musical. So what we're listening to is the looper playing back this ambient chord progression. I've got the same sample loaded into both decks, so if I want, I could unlink it and get two versions of the same playback, or two versions of playback of the same source. That's feeding into the arbor, which is auto capturing into the buffer based on onset detection. So every time there's a new chord playing, it's auto capturing. We're listening to the direct looper signal, which is that, and then stereo granular playback coming into this càrn here. There we go. So the main influence I'm going to put on this patch is I'll bring the playback length down, and I'm going to be using CV to modulate the start position. The CV is all going to be curated via the càrn, so that's gives us something nice visually, and hopefully something that's more pleasant to listen to musically. Okay, here we go. So we're going to be focusing on this càrn, and I've got this very much curated and set up for processing DC signals. So each of the channels is DC coupled. The DC coupling or AC coupling is defined, that occurs post-fader, so post-fader stage in each channel, and between the output jack's internal normal and the panning circuitry. So it means if I were to patch out from the direct output, I'm getting the post-fader effect, but the signal is then broken going to the panning, so it's broken going to the stereo mixer. So if you have half normaling defined, you can choose to isolate a channel for just throughput processing based on the fader without it affecting your stereo mix, in which case you could have a couple of channels with signals coming in with pan distribution to a stereo feed. But you could also fully normal all channels, pull out parallel branches, so you can use it to an extent like an aux send. The other detail I've got for this càrn is the limiter is disengaged, so there's no soft clipping or wave shaping applied to the stereo output, which means that we retain perfect linearity from the per channel stages. Post fader, post pan, this signal, there's no wave shaping applied. So if we have a reference point DC voltage, that can pass through to a unity gain stage, and there are actually some targets that I designed to try and optimize that use case. So if you wanted to use the stereo VCA more just as a dual mono or parallel CV processing VCA set, then you could use that and have a good reference point for where your unity gain is. So this will all make a lot more sense when I throw it up on the oscilloscope and we can actually see it in practice. So I'm going to be using this 1F as a manual DC offset. I'm going into channel 1 here, and that's giving me 0 to 10 volts. So if I set the fader to the middle, that's going to be my 5 volt point. So to visualize that, I can patch that onto my start position, bring length down, and I've now got this manual CV scrubbing through the buffer. There we go. Okay, so before we get to that stage though, let's come out of the scope and let's run that through our first channel of the càrn. And I'm going to patch the channel output through the scope as well, so we can now see it in parallel. And then that signal is what's controlling my looper. So it's now an attenuated version of this DC 5 volt offset. So you might already have spotted a couple of quirks, a couple of details to this fader channel on the càrn. I'll try and get a smooth motion right on the fader and freeze it visually on the scope. There you go, that was pretty close. So you can see here, this is far from a linear ramp. So I tried to move that in as smooth a linear motion as I could. But it's actually applied a curvature to this DC signal. So this is because the fader itself is audio tapered in response curve. Quite naturally actually, so you'll see it's a dynamic curve following that logarithmic shaping up to unity gain. The way that manufactured audio tapered potentiometers or faders are produced, it's they actually just have two cascaded linear response curves. So instead of it being a smooth response like that, it's a linear ramp and then another linear ramp. So it's got essentially got a knee. So it's approximating an audio tapered response. I think it's just down to ease of manufacturing. Makes it a little bit easier to produce. So this is achieved through parallel resistors with the with the linear tapering of the potentiometer, which allowed me to closely approximate the logarithmic audio taper response curve. So it's much smoother overall. Of course, this doesn't get applied to the voltage itself. So if I move this, then I'm just getting smooth linear movement, because it's just the response curve of the potentiometer as an attenuator that has the curvature, not the effect to the linear input voltage, if that makes sense. A bit of a distinction there. You'll also see I'm hitting my unity gain point with the fader not quite at its maximum, so there's actually a little bit of headroom. So this is by design, so it means that there's a unity gain point when mixing audio signals, but then you can actually boost it a little bit. Which works for both DC and AC coupled signals, or AC signals. So audio signals you'll be able to boost a little bit of headroom in terms of loudness. CV signals you can stretch it a little bit, so you can amplify. There we go. I'll match that as close as I can. That's it. So the fader itself is actually an attenuator over this incoming signal. So if I were to remove that and send in an LFO, a bipolar LFO, for example, then I'm going to be attenuating that down. So if I attenuate it down so that I'm hitting roughly a 2.5 volt point, then that's still keeping 5 volts peak to peak. It means I could center my start position and then get nice smooth motion through the range of the parameter. So this is scaling the bipolar control signal as it's coming in. So this is the low frequency equivalent of attenuating an audio signal. But for DC, it works as a bipolar attenuator. Cool. Okay, let's move on to our second channel. I'm going to go back to our DC offset from the 1F. You can see this has got the exact same audio tapered response curve to it. And there's also a match to the unity gain point that I found on my first channel. There we go, unity gain on channel 2. So fundamental difference in circuitry, this channel is actually a linear 2-quadrant VCA. So the CV input is, it's got a DC reference behind it, so when nothing patched there, there's a DC voltage that's attenuated by this fader, which is what we're seeing control the amplitude. So that voltage is controlling the amplitude of the signal via the VCA. So in this case, I would want to use a unipolar positive signal, but if I go with this cycling knock, I could patch that in here, reduce the amplitude to get it so it's hitting a 5 volt peak. Slow it down a bit. There we go. So I've got, in this case, because my carrier signal or input signal is just a static DC offset, it's that green 5 volt signal, I'm attenuating that dynamically with a unipolar positive envelope. So that's giving me the effect of, the LFOs passing through directly. Or the other option, I could switch these in this instance, in which case my envelope is passing through the channel, and I could simply use the fader to attenuate that. Or if I was wanting to control that separately, I could use an external voltage to scale, and amplify that if I needed. So this is all low frequency territory, but this all tracks the same for audio rate modulation applications. Okay, let's get back to our reference point. No more dynamic modulation. I'll get this back to 5 volts on the green line and settle that on our unity gain point. There we go. So these two are both at unity gain, faders at a pretty close equivalent so far. Move to channel 3. And initially, this looks no different. We've got that same audio tapered response curve plus headroom. The difference here being we have a polarity switch. So this channel is actually a 4-quadrant multiplier. The switch in the middle, it's changing the range that this fader can produce as a DC offset. So to the right, this is 0 to 5 volts. If I go to the negative, I've actually got -5 to +5. And the range is adjusted so that we gain that extra bit of headroom again that matches the previous channels, even with it being a completely different circuit under the hood. So, audio tapered response curve, a little bit of headroom. If I change this to being bipolar, I can bring my reference voltage back down to 2.5, center my start control. I've now got bipolar sweeping of this DC offset through 0. So this is now in attenuverter mode, and it's actually a CV controlled attenuverter. So I could center my fader, get that to precisely 0, I could then use a modulation signal. And that will be summing with the fader position. So I can choose whether it's CV used to modulate the polarity, the attenuate version of it, or use the fader manually to define that. And you can see there's also non-linearity retained when in the bipolar configuration. There we go. So we've got that, tan H-like S-curve, although inverted, flipped on its axis. So there's a benefit to this. It's giving us more of a plateau around the center 0 volt point of the fader. So it means that there's actual higher electromechanical resolution for finding that center point, that 0 point. But the channel itself is calibrated so that the fader all the way down in the positive, unipolar positive configuration is silenced, and that will give a really clean carrier rejection. It will mute that input signal to the same degree as the first two channels. Okay, let's go back to a unity reference point, reset that. Okay, so in practice use case, if this is in positive, then these three channels share a very common behavior in terms of non-linear response curve and extra headroom. This is where we get to an odd one out territory. The fourth channel is a little bit different. So you can see I'm moving this fader linear, and I'm actually getting that linear movement translated to the signal attenuation. So this is a very different circuit again from the previous three. This is no CV input, but it's got a secondary input for audio or CV, and it's much the same as the 1F. So this is two inputs and it crossfades between the two. So you'll also see if I put this fader up to the maximum, that's us hitting our unity gain point. So this one doesn't have that extra degree of headroom. That's by design. I realized if I boosted the gain post crossfader, it would give an inaccurate representation if I was crossfading between two linear signals, or just two signals in general. It would mean if I was in the center position, I'd have a 50-50 mix between the two signals, but it would need to be that signal that was amplified to achieve that equivalent gain stage if it was just a single-ended attenuation over one signal. So it made more sense to keep this linear and have it hit unity at its upper reach. So a way we could see this in practice, let's keep with this LFO. So if I patch this here, center my start position. So I bring this down, I'm unattenuating the LFO. And as I bring it up, I'm attenuating the LFO, but actually crossfading it with a DC offset, which is coming from this channel here. So I'm creating at a certain point, I could create a unipolar positive attenuated triangle. So it can be signal attenuator or signal crossfader, much in the same way that the 1F functions. I shared the same iconography for the crossfade pattern. So it's the same as the 1F, but minus the polarity inversion control. So there is a detail to keep in mind. If you're using the càrn for audio mixing purposes, the fourth channel is in practice the sort of weakest in terms of signal clarity, because it's a very simple circuit. Obviously, I ran out of room at a certain point, so I had to keep this one more self-contained. So it's the same circuit that's in the 1F, but it's ultimately a passive crossfader where the two inputs go straight to either end of this potentiometer, and then the taper gets buffered at an active stage. But comparatively to the other channels, there might not be quite as clean and distinct a full attenuation. So if you are mixing audio, that's something to bear in mind. Just curate the optimum signals for each channel. So if you've got a voice that is naturally pre-attenuated, or being gated in terms of dynamic amplitude, that might be a good candidate for this channel. Or anything that's the most mellow voice will be most effectively attenuated. But yeah, that's the 4 channels in a nutshell. The unity gain points for all 4. This one is all the way up. The other ones give you a bit of headroom. The first 3 have got audio tapering response curve. The 4th one is a linear crossfader between 2 source signals. Cool. Okay, so that's the per channel configuration. Let's take a look at the stereo output. Let's go with our second channel as a reference point here. I'm going to set this to being our unity gain point. I'm now going to patch out from here, and I'm going to view this. There we go. View this from our stereo output. Let's go. Let's go right on yellow. Let's go left on red. So now, as I'm panning this, we'll see this cross-panning behavior. What I'll also do is take this second CV output, so the pan distribution of this single DC offset signal, and I'll patch that to start position of my second looper channel. So I'll unlink them. This is playing in reverse, so we can just see a bit of difference there. But now I can control these together, or I can even pan the CV, set that to hard left. Or set it to hard right. Or keep them in parallel. So the panning circuit, this is designed for equal, to have an equal loudness contour. You can see as I'm turning the pan control, it's the opposite of a crossfader, so it's a two-way distribution. And they overlap, but there's there's more movement below that match point. So equal power panning, it's a drop of 3 decibels at the sum point. So it means that when you have a same mono signal that's center panned, you have the same SPL or same signal produced at each speaker, but when they're played together, if they're both equally at a reduction of 3 decibels, then you retain a more consistent loudness distribution. So if you pan something smoothly from left through right, the center position, you've got equal balance between left and right, but if you don't have that 3 decibels down point, you'll end up with a louder apparent loudness, more apparent loudness at that stage. So a quirk of this is it means that hard left or hard right is going to be a higher output amplitude per mono channel left or right individually than it is when you're panned in the center. So a target I designed to sort of approximate was to have the level control roughly at the 3 o'clock position, thereabouts. And that's where panned hard left, unity gain position of this channel. So if we look at this here, there we go, we're hitting unity gain, so that's in line with the green trace. I've got that panned hard left, so if I now pull that from my left output, we're getting a good ballpark of that also being unity gain through the stereo mix. So it means that this up to that position, there's a bit of headroom to push it above, much like the fader on its own. And this is giving us a linear response. This means we've got linear VCA response over that channel, and likewise if I go the other direction, then that's going to be giving us another, the other side, so that right channel out here. There we go, let's get that to unity gain. unity gain in the fader, individual channel, and at the output with the level control at approximately 3 o'clock position, that's also hitting our unity gain point. So in practice, you're really going to be looking for these exact benchmarks, but I figured it was going to be useful to display this in the video as a reference point for where unity gain lies at these various cascaded stages, which is only readily accessible and visible when you've got everything DC coupled and the limiter disengaged, like in this configuration. But yeah, I thought it would be a helpful reference point for anyone that's interested in the more under the hood mechanics of it all. So channel 1's unique quirk or superpower is that the panning is CV controllable. So this is a very different circuit implementation than the panning on 2, 3 and 4, which is using just essentially like a passive pan pot. It's the same circuit that's used in lots of traditional mixers, but this one I had to go with 2 parallel VCAs for left and right, and then the CV comes in is duplicated. It's then inverted and offset, so I then have a perfect crossover, or going that way, of the control voltage signal. Each one's then got its own discrete wave shaping using a fine-tuned diode circuit to get non-linearity to give that equal loudness 3 dB down point at the center position, and it's yeah, I'm very, very happy with how accurate it ended up being in comparison to the other pan channels. So let's add some CV panning over this so we've got some variable distribution over playback reels. I'll use an LFO. Can patch that in direct. But the benefit of the càrn is if I need this to be fine-tuned at all, I could even run this via another channel and use that as a means of processing the signal. So you see, I patched it into channel 2. It's now getting through to the stereo output. So what I might want to do before doing that is patch out. That's breaking the normal going through, so I won't end up with a portion of time where I've inadvertently sent CV somewhere I didn't intend it to go. This is now the source. Patch this here. I can now attenuate my LFO using this channel. Yeah, I think that covers all the ins and outs in a bit of detail. I guess the last thing I didn't look at was the CV input over the stereo output. So this is CV with attenuator. I put this here. I now have a secondary LFO controlling the overall amplitude. So I'm going to boost that up a bit so that I've got the level curated a bit more full range. So I've now added 2 LFOs. One is controlling the panning distribution of channel 1, which is panning the distribution of our static DC offset 5 volt signal. That's going through the stereo output, but I have a secondary LFO controlling the parallel output amplitude of left and right, which is just adding a bit more variation and randomization to the CV going to my looper decks here. Yeah, that's CV processing using the càrn. Okay, this might be one of the longer sections of this video. I want to show some examples and context of the càrn in use as a dedicated audio mixer. So up in the right here, I've got these 2 cascaded, this one connected in the back to this càrn, connected in the back to this cure, which is my stereo line output, which everything in this video is recorded from. The rightmost càrn, I've got this set up in probably the most vanilla factory default configuration where each channel is AC coupled going to the stereo mixer, and it's the individual outputs are half normal, meaning that if I patch from one of the outputs, it's going to break the signal post fader, pre-pan, before it goes to the stereo mix. So it means that you could run a signal through an individual channel, break it. It's not going to go to the stereo mix, so you could use it as an isolated voltage control processor or CV processor or audio processor, separate from the actual stereo mix. So the context I kind of envisioned for the càrn, or designed it with the intent for, was if you're patching on a system where you're curating a collection of voices. So I personally like to patch building up multiple voices that I can then interact with dynamically. These all tend to break out individually through either multiple cures, multiple stereo outputs, or mix in a more formal way after the modular. I tend not to mix the entire thing to two in a single context, which is entirely personal preference. I think you get a lot more hands-on control with a bigger outboard mixer. Either that or just capturing in parallel, capturing in stems. It gives a lot more flexibility for mixing in post. But it means that my way of mixing any one voice could be a combination of multiple sub-voices, essentially. So I might be using a submixer to combine multiple outputs from a CSL, or layering different aspects, parallel filtering, parallel compression. It could be quite dense, but I then want to combine that to a single either stereo stem or mono stem. The càrn's very well suited for this application. So let's dive in. I'm going to keep things quite straightforward to start with. I'm just going to come from a sawtooth wave from the top of the CSL, and we're just going to run this through each of these two càrns. So this one on the left, the limiter is disengaged. It's almost identical settings, but no limiting on the output. So this is it bypassed, kind of treated it more as if it's going to be a DC summer for combining control voltage signals. But then again, you might also want to mix audio with it disengaged to give, you can retain a degree of clarity, but you also are at a much higher risk of hard clipping if you push the levels too hard. So if they hit too high, then you're going to be restricted by the rail-to-rail peaks of the op-amp buffering stages of the fundamental circuitry. But if you're mixing with the limiter engaged, you've got a lot more flexibility to just drive signals into it, and things will just musically self-contain. So I'm going to be demonstrating that quite a lot in this video. So let's come out of here. I'm going to patch this sawtooth wave into both càrns in parallel, and then I can bring them up individually, and we can hear and see the difference visualized and monitored. Let me grab a mult, and I'm going to use channel 2 on each of these. Just because that's the kind of the more traditional voice, where the CV input, it normals to the fader, so the fader becomes a CV attenuator. If there's no CV patched in, it's got a DC reference, so it just becomes a direct mixer channel, essentially. I'm going to come from just one of the master outputs on the rightmost càrn, and we'll view that on this channel of the scope. Tuck this in here out of the way. There we go. So if I bring up a level on this càrn, the output is a branch of these direct modular outputs, connects in the back to the input of this càrn, and sums at unity with its own stereo signal, which then cascades further through its own backjack output to the cure. So it means I've got a master submix level per càrn, which becomes very useful when you are using it in a sort of submix type configuration. So as I bring up the sawtooth level here on my first càrn, we can see that coming through. I'm keeping the output levels at approximately 12 o'clock position. So I very much designed it with that in mind as being a good sweet spot. If you just keep it 12 o'clock starting point, you've got plenty of headroom to boost the stereo mix up, going further down your audio signal path, and plenty of room to attenuate it or CV attenuate it via the CV input. And you'll see this is sitting at a comparatively low amplitude to the original sawtooth wave. The reason for this is if we imagine this signal were summed or mixed to all four in parallel, or if you had similar enough signals and amplitudes, the potential peak-to-peak signal could completely blow past the peak-to-peak capability of the output buffer stage. So you're going to hard clip. So keeping it more reined in and then having the ability to boost up to unity to a considerable amount, it adds for a lot more flexibility. So let's compare to our default càrn. There we go. So you can see there's a lot more headroom, like this is going up to a much higher peak-to-peak signal with being pan center. This is 3 dB down compared to both parallel left and right channels. But we're just referencing between the two càrns on the scope, so we can keep all this centered. So if I were to try and match this peak-to-peak default linear ramp on the default càrn, I can actually reduce my output level down by a quarter turn essentially, and then bringing that up, this becomes my control over essentially saturation through the limiter, like how hard it's going to be hitting this soft clipping limiter circuit. So you can see on the oscilloscope this is translating to amplitude soft clipping saturation of the sawtooth wave. So it's very reminiscent of tan H, but because it's Zener diode based, we retain a lot more linearity of the ramp over a wider range, and then it's only past a certain threshold that will start to more noticeably soft clip. Very useful circuit. Anyone that is familiar with the Instruō stereo oscillator, it's got the exact same soft clipping stage at its parallel stereo output. So when you're layering up to 6 sawtooth waves, it's going to keep it reined in without hard clipping in the same manner that the càrn behaves. Okay, so that gives a bit of a reference point for where the wave shaping starts and where things are going to be sitting. Let's use a more musical voice. I'm going to jump down to this wave folder on the CSL, set this to being LFO, and that's nicer. So this is now LFO sine wave that's modulating my wavefold depth and symmetry in parallel. So static tone, but just a nice evolving timbre. So this is us hearing it through the bypassed càrn. Let's listen to it through the default càrn. You can hear there's a much more prominent higher amplitude overall. Like the loudness is pushed a bit more, so probably equivalent to if this fader was in its half position compared to the bypass one being at maximum. So the dynamic range is essentially reduced by this limiter stage, but you can get a closer approximation if we reduce the output level to there. So that's a pretty good comparison. Okay, voice number 1. Let's add some percussion. I've got this looper running essentially a stereo sample, which is a curated acoustic drum loop recording that I used quite recently for a live set. I know the sample quite well at this stage, so I thought it could be a good one for me to demonstrate with. Okay, so here's my bypass càrn with the 12 o'clock default position. This is a more basic read on what the sample is. If I pan to the left deck here, I've got only direct ride cymbal, isolated ride cymbal. And to the right, this is the, just going around the kit, a bit of snare drum work. I'll keep a bit of a blend between both. Quite a filled out drum sound. And I'll bring it up on my right càrn, and I'm going to put the output level back to its 12 o'clock default. Which means to match that approximate level, I only need to have the fader about halfway compared to there. And this, more noticeably, this being a higher transient signal, it's not a static, static amplitude pad. There are more ups and downs, more peaks and troughs in the overall amplitude of the signal. The dynamic range reduction, it's kind of just filled everything out, so everything just feels a lot more present. Just maybe that once more. So this is the limited version, bypassed version. So this is where things become really practical with the limiter engaged by default. If I bring up my pad voice, keep them approximately the same level per fader. Compare that to our bypassed càrn. Some overall lower loudness because we've got these at matched level, so this is actually driving a bit higher. Comparative gain staging, if I have this at about middle position, that should be about balanced. So what I've found with a lot of experimenting as I was developing this module, if you are mixing signals into a limiter quite an early stage, there kind of becomes a degree of automatic mixing that gets applied, where if we think about what's happening here, I'm now driving my pad voice, my bass voice, in amplitude. It's going to be approaching that limiter's threshold a bit sooner. So maybe if that's below threshold and then pushing into the threshold, if I just bring up my drums slightly, so that's not a lot of level brought up on this fader, but there's still quite a nice amount of clarity coming through. Like the ride cymbal is quite prominent, the toms, they're maybe a bit more subdued, but essentially the static pad voice, it's kind of hit its peak and the drums are coming in and they're just filling in up to that matched peak. Whereas if I match these levels here on my bypassed càrn, there we go, it's about balanced. The drum voices are much less prominent, so to get a more natural sounding mix, I'm going to need to be a bit more hands-on and actively mix it, where I'm probably going to want to push my higher transient signal further and get the static pad out the way to get a more natural sounding mix. So I've essentially inverted the balance of these two faders. Let's go back to the default càrn. Up slightly, but they don't need to be pushed up all that much. So this is with the CSL voice maxed out, and the drums just brought up a little bit more. Already that's sitting in quite a nice balance. drive the drums further, there will be a point where I'm getting it just below the peak-to-peak threshold of the limiter. As I drive further into it, it's going to be adding harmonic distortion to the hits, which is definitely not hard clipping. It's a very distinctive sound. It's much softer. It's you know, in practice it's a soft clipping stage. But even if I just like crudely match these in amplitude together, I'm just bringing up both levels in parallel. Both are at this stage, you know, riding that line just, you know, just touching the threshold of the limiter. Already that's quite a nice natural sounding mix compared to setting those same balances. To get the same sort of prominence and body to the drum voice, I'm needing to push it a bit higher than on the equivalent default càrn. Okay, let's take this a step further and add another percussion element. I'm going to use the trigger output, the clock output from this looper. So it's set to 32 divisions per loop. Let's go more, let's go 64. And I'm going to use this as my clock signal to drive a more synthetic synth kick. So I'm just going to use a resonant 1047 filter. Mult this signal so that I'm going from strike input, and simultaneously I'll clock an AR from this knock. Let's start basic. I'll mute all these and we'll just listen to this voice as dry as possible, so through the bypassed càrn for reference. There we go. I hide that channel, zoom out a bit. There we go, you can see that on the scope. Okay, so now to get a bit more prominence to this, let's take my envelope and I'll send that to the FM input. It's definitely too long. There we go. Reduce the resonance a bit to tighten up the decay time. And because everything sounds better through tan H, let's go through tan H. There we go. So this is a nice dry signal. I've had to max out my output level to get closer to the actual peak-to-peak discrete audio. I need another mult. I'll mult this to my second default càrn as well. Okay, now let's compare. So I'll mute this down and I'm just going to bring up the level on the default càrn. You can see I only need to bring the fader to about the middle position to get a sort of equivalent loudness, and that's with the output level, stereo output level at the 12 o'clock position. And it doesn't sound too altered in terms of saturation at the limiter. As I push it more, we're definitely getting that harmonic distortion a bit more. Okay, I'll bring these back to a comparative output output gain stage. Let's start with the bypassed. Bring the bass voice back in. Bring this kick up. So to retain the sort of prominence as much as I can from the kick voice, I'm having to keep the bass pad quite low in amplitude. And we keep this to just ride cymbal, so we've got sort of higher rhythmic component over the top of the synthetic kick. So it's really a balancing act of getting everything leveled out, naturally sounding. So this kick needs a lot of level to get the prominence that I want, and too much of the CSL voice, and it's kind of drowning the kick out a bit too much. Okay, let's mute that and let's go to our default càrn. So especially with much more prominent higher transient signals or something like this, like a kick, it's the limiter can do a really good job of just keeping things really naturally contained. So there's a wide amount of range of difference in amplitude of the CSL voice that I can play with, and the kick doesn't really lose prominence within that range. And the right cymbal. So I'll bring all these down, and I'm just going to ride them all up together in parallel. That's quite a nice natural balance as it is, without having to micromanage the discrete amplitudes per channel. Compared to here, where I really need to boost the output level considerably to get that same level of prominence. And I don't really want to bring up my CSL pad much more. Without one channel overpowering the other. Quite a simple circuit implementation of soft clipping. I took a lot of considerations in getting the amplitude thresholds in terms of voltage amplitude dialed into a really, as universal a spot as I could. Yeah, it means that you can just keep things in a nice comfortable mid-range, giving you more headroom as needed on both the per channel voices and at the output level. So beyond the 12 o'clock position essentially becomes saturation. So it becomes timbre, it becomes colour, as opposed to without the limiter, where you need to micromanage a lot more. And this is kind of more akin to post-production mixing, where if this is broken out as pad voice and drum voice, where drums ideally I would want to have a bit of isolation between kick, snare, hats, I would likely process a degree of compression and limiting or EQ or processing per voice, per channel, to get the level of tightness I'd want. But on a pinch, this does a pretty good job with very minimal effort mixing it in together. So it's a nice quick way of combining signals, keeping it musical and being able to patch dynamically on the fly and not have to worry too much about gain staging. Okay, a last trick. I'm going to show the cure. It's got its own left-right input, This actually becomes an additional stereo input that sums at unity with any signals that are coming in at the back. So this serves for quite a nice utility for bringing in maybe a parallel stereo voice or parallel effect, stuff like that. So what I'll do, I'm going to take my CSL voice and I'm going to run that into the arbor here, and I'll patch that out using left and right, giving me a stereo source. Okay, I'm going to capture in just a buffer of this slowly evolving. That'll do. Okay, let's mute that. Let's bring up our granular playback. Bring this up by an octave or two. Volt per octave, and it'll come from the harmony. Let's keep it that octave. Okay, I'm going to take my original voice, CSL, and I'm going to mix that back in via channel 2 on the càrn. This one here, and I now have this additional stereo playback. That's an octave up resampling of my voice. Use the pitch deviation, throw that up so it's jumping in octaves, and actually bring that down. I'll see if I can get it to a more harmonic position. Okay, let's blur it a little bit by using the built-in reverb. So this could be dynamic effects, especially if I had the càrn set to fully normaled. I could even patch out of per channel without breaking it, going to the stereo mix, send that through parallel effects, bring that in as a stereo input back, directly to the cure. Yeah, a very versatile modular mixer, or modular mixer. So I did a bit of patch problem solving recently. That came out when I was writing all the prep for this video, and I kind of realised that channel 4 is a bit of an odd one out of the 4 channels on the càrn. Channels 1, 2, and 3 each have their own dedicated CV input. So CV over panning, CV over amplitude as typical linear VCA, and CV over amplitude and inversion. So CV controlled attenuversion, or 4-quadrant multiplication. Channel 4 is a bit more basic, where there are 2 inputs and they crossfade to 1. So it's essentially just a duplicate of the feature set of the 1F incorporated into the càrn itself. So crossfading, let me look at something as a demonstration. 2 signals in, 1 signal out. And I'll just put that up on the scope here. And I'll clock the scope from square wave. Here we go. So 2 waveforms, and it's crossfading between these 2 waveforms. So it's linear interpolation between these 2 audio signals. So let's listen to this. Push that to my output càrn. There, so that's morphing from, let's switch them around, sine wave up to the step square. So there is a bit of a quirk here where we can see that these 2 waveforms from the CSL are effectively out of phase. That's just down to the orientation of the wave shaping there. But to get around that, I'm going to just phase invert one of these by 180 degrees. So I'll patch this through my 4-quadrant multiplier here on this càrn. So this is a 10U version, but because this has got the half normal, I can run it through that channel without having to hear it. So I've now modified this version, my signal. There we go, that's quite a nice pair of signals to crossfade between. Okay, so the patch problem solving that I came to was figuring out a way to add voltage control over this feature. So creating a voltage controlled crossfader, which the càrn doesn't have natively as a feature of a single channel. I ran out of jacks, or ran out of space for jacks. But there is a way to patch it up to achieve this with control voltage capability. It takes a bit of utilization of various things and patching within the càrn itself, but it's quite achievable and quite a useful patch technique. Let's dive in. So if we conceptually think about a voltage controlled crossfader, it's effectively just 2 VCAs. So as one turns up, the other one turns down. So it's just taking this contrast between 2 amplitudes and summing them together. So let's work our way through and build this up bit by bit. We'll start with the sine wave signal, and let's start by getting voltage control over that on its own. So patch this out here, send this to my lower input, so I'm currently crossfading manually here. And going through channel 2, this is just a traditional VCA. So I already, I now have control voltage capability over this. There we go. So that is halfway up, and I'll get that to ballpark unity gain, maybe a bit below unity. So I have sine wave, and I want to dynamically crossfade that to my step square. So as this voltage comes up, I'll need a parallel voltage to go down, so we get this crossover effect. And I can do that within the càrn because I've got a 4-quadrant multiplier, or a 10U verter. So I'll need a multiple, and I'm going to branch this manual CV through my quadrature channel. So now as I turn this up, you can see I'm getting negative amplitude of the same control voltage source. So if we visualize that on the scope, patch this out from here, let's put that on the yellow channel. There we go. So as this goes up, amplitude of the sine wave comes up, and the bias of that inverted version goes down. So I've used up my primary VCA, I've used up my quadrature VCA, just using it as a signal inverter. The càrn fortunately has 2 more VCAs to offer, and that's in the form of the stereo output. So it's two VCAs controlled from a common source, but we can take full advantage of this. I've got this càrn is set up with the limiter disengaged, so we've kept linearity and retained DC coupling through all the channels. So I need to take my pulse signal and I'm going to run that into channel 1. There we go. You can see that here. So channel 1 is now just attenuating that secondary signal. But to get voltage control over that, if I monitor it from the stereo output, let's go right channel, I'll pan this hard right, so I've got maximum or unity gain at that stage, and I've got CV input over this version. So all I need to do now is take my DC offset, negative DC offset. Actually, that's quite a nice representation there. As I bring up my CV control, that's bringing up my sine wave through channel 2. That same DC signal is being inverted and pushing negative. Because I've not got anything patched out from channel 3, it's summing at the stereo output, so we can see the DC offset on that yellow signal on the stepped square. So I just need to pull that signal out separately, and I can patch that to the CV input of my stereo output. So now as I bring up my green amplitude, sine wave amplitude, I've faded out my stepped square. So we're still only listening to the sine wave currently, because it's still going via this crossfader, but that leads us to the last stage. I just need to recombine these 2 signals, and I can do that directly on the càrn because I've got this passive crossfader channel left over. So I'll come out from here, which is my yellow channel on the scope, patch that to the top input. If I mute this, wrong one, keep the green one, mute the yellow one. There we go. I might actually flip these round. There we go. This way I've got positive CV going to the stepped square, and all the way down is the sine, so I'm kind of increasing harmonics on that signal. And that's it, success. We've now got voltage control over crossfade. Let's actually add some variable voltage to that. Because it's fully analog, this can be run at audio rate, of course. Yeah, a very useful wave shaping technique. You see this technique quite a lot in VCV rack, where you've got infinite mixers that you can just add in at the click of a mouse. So I see that quite a lot where people are patching up voltage control crossfading or mixing over it. But with the càrn, you've got a wide range of utilities that you can achieve actual voltage control patches like this. go a step further. Let's change this out for a so instead of sine wave, I've now got the wave folder output. Add some internal modulation to the CSL. Voltage controlled crossfading. Next up's a rather interesting stereo patching technique, which is something that I used quite recently in a performance. I'm going to use the CSL as a stereo voice, using the two final outputs with the cores hard synced. That way it's a common fundamental pitch, but variable timbre that's similar but ultimately different between left and right. I'll run these through the scope so that we can see a combination of the two voices. There we go. And each of these is going to be patched through its own 1047 filter. There we go. I'll be using low pass for each, so I'll send these out to left and right. This càrn here in the far right, that's set up with channels 1 and 2, panned hard left, hard right, so I'll use that as my stereo input. Nice. So each wave folder control varies the timbre per channel. I've got the CSL configured so that the index bus is going to each oscillator sine wave is via the index control to the opposite oscillator's wavefold symmetry. So it's essentially summing in both sine waves together at each wave folder at different amounts and different inversions. So this one's set negative, this one's set positive. I'll set them both positive just in case we get any weird phasey wazy stuff. Hard sync, I've got it down 1 sub and a degree of linear FM brought up on the top voice with it hard sync to the bottom. So it means that my lower voice is defining my fundamental and top voice is defining my timbre. So let's get this playing something a bit more melodic. Got the harmony set up to a minor triad, and I'm just going to sample and hold. Let's go with the triangle wave, and I'll use this knock here as a clock. So end of cycle. There we go. So I'm getting some arpeggiation. Volt per octave out. Slow down a bit. So I'll get different effects if I have the two oscillators linked or not, where both are going to be tracking in unison with this FM hard synced combination. So you get a bit more consistent timbre retained here. I quite like it when it's a bit different. Go bring the index all the way down, kind of spreads it out a bit more. Hard left, hard right. Cool. Okay, and the main focus of this patch is going to be this càrn here as a CV control hub. So I'm going to be using this to branch out control voltage to both my filters, potentially to the CSL as well. So first up, I'm going to want this to be used as a manual offset, and I can use that to control my fundamental cutoff frequency. So I'll sum that in as one source. I should note that this càrn is set up to being DC coupled on all inputs and the limiter disengaged, so this is very much optimized for DC summing or control voltage mixing. And I'm going to come out of here. I'll actually monitor this on the scope as well. It might be a more useful visualization than the two audio waves. Move these down. There we go. There we go. So that's manual DC offset, and that's going to both left and right together in parallel because I've got it panned central. There we go. Okay, so this is left and this is right. So I'm going to patch this to my left filter and patch this to my right filter. Bring the cutoffs down a bit. So I'm now using this manual offset as my parallel volt per octave, or a parallel cutoff frequency control. And there's a benefit to using this this channel here, it being the attenuverter. It means that I can set a maximum and I can actually go through 0 volts, which is pulling me negative, pulling the cutoff frequency down. So I've got a good range of control here. Okay, let's get some actual stereo panning action. So here's the trick. Here's the main detail of this patch. I'm going to use the gate out from the harmony, and I'm going to clock this envelope. And I'll use this as a percussive element. So it's going to be plucking each filter together. Output of this, I'm going to patch that here to channel 1. So I can define my fundamental cutoff frequency level with channel 3. And I can pull it down quite low or push it up quite a bit. And this is the depth of my envelope. It's a bit more even. Okay, so this is where things get interesting. This is stereo CV, essentially, so left-right split. I can pan this now, and because it's DC coupled through the chain in the càrn, I can offset between the two 1047s where it's sending this envelope. So you can see here on the let's mute these two. I'm defining the axis angle for which filter is getting more of the envelope. So stereo panning, but not as we know it, essentially. I'm going to add in a couple more things. Let's take this slower LFO. I'm going to patch it to my second channel. And this is just going to add a bit of gradual overall movement in addition to this manual setting. Bring the depth down a little bit. Don't want to go quite as low, but I just want a bit of bigger motion to the cutoff frequencies. And then I've got one channel left, so I'm actually going to run this third LFO through channel 4 and patch directly out of it. So I'm using this fourth channel as a CV attenuator. So I can scale the amplitude of that modulator. I'll now patch this to my CV input of channel 1. Bring in one more LFO, just add a bit more motion to the fundamental timbre via the CSL's index CV. So as we can now see on the oscilloscope, just move that over a bit. So that variable XY scope display, that's displaying our panning from hard left to hard right, and increase the depth of that so we're actually hitting the peaks. Stereo panning by panning CV signals through a DC coupled utility mixer.